Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and I'm here with the sixth and final of my video series chronicling all of the addition changes for every faction, how they affect those factions, etc. I'm very excited to be A, of all this close to the end, B, ready to start brewing soon, and yeah, just these are some of the most exciting factions in the game, in my opinion, that are happening in this video. So let's just get straight to it. Daughters of Khaine. The reaction is going to be gladiatorial display. After targeted by a melee attack, but before hit rolls are made, if none of the hit rolls from that are a crit, allocate 4 damage points to the attacking fighter. I don't think it's very good. Now, the kind of inflection point is on a fighter with 3 attacks. So 42% of the time, you'll trigger the reaction. So, 4 times 0.42 is 1.68, which is the EV, essentially. With toughness 3, counter is often going to be an EV of 1.5 damage against 3 attacks. So this is barely an upgrade over counter. The only thing maybe is, some situations you really want to aim high for how much damage you deal, as opposed to where counter, it's usually going to do 1 or 2, whereas this is usually going to go 0, but sometimes 4. Very good against anyone who for some reason is only throwing 2 strength 3 attacks or something, but otherwise it's not a very exciting reaction. Even in ideal circumstances, it's not enough of an upgrade to be exciting. Daughters of Khaine, though, they do have some other stuff going on. So, one, they've got a new ability, Killing Stroke. Pick a visible enemy fighter on a roll up 3 up. Allocate 3 damage points to that fighter. That's a decent chance of finishing off wounded fighters. Something that, I'm starting to think more and more is going to be at a premium in this edition, where archery is just harder to pull off. These abilities that kind of give you a 2/3 chance to just finish someone off are going to be nice. Not having to kind of waste an action for it. Heartseekers was buffed. It triggers on hits now, which is just a slightly higher percentage play than before it triggered on crits. Orgy of Slaughter was nerfed. It only adds damage to crits. It's a quad now. You wouldn't even be that excited about it if it were a triple, so just don't even read this when you get to your ability section if you're a doc player. Their profiles. So the first thing to take a look at, the Bloodrack Medusa and the Gorgai, those were the really scary snake queens. Just absolute monsters. They'll still perform that role. The Bloodrack Medusa is still absolutely going to dominate games, but they were nerfed. A lot more points now to put them in your lists. Kind of tough, but if you do want to sort of build a list that revolves around them, you catch up a little bit based on these Blood Sisters and just the way that the rank and file snakes were kind of buffed to kind of make up for the leader snakes getting their nerfs. So Blood Sisters going from 170 to 155 without taking any changes is really nice. Having sort of speedy fighters that can actually hold up in a fight once they get to where they're going is generally at a premium in this game. It's just a really solid thing to have, and Blood Sisters fit that bill really nicely. So a mostly snake warband is in play in a way that it wasn't necessarily before, especially because the Sister of Slaughter with the whip and the knife went up 5 points. Kind of painful because for your old Daughters of Khaine lists, both the leader, the Bloodrack Medusa, and the Gorgai, you were usually playing both of them. And the troops, the Sisters of Slaughter, both of those went up. So those lists have lost an entire fighter out of them. So they're a lot weaker now than they were before. So I think you're really heavily incentivized to really take a look at some of the fighters that got some buffs, right? I already talked about the snakes, the Batwomen, the Valkyries here, the Canary, Heartrender, and Lifetaker. They took, the basic models took some huge buffs in terms of points drops. compared to, where they were before. Now, before they were really in a rough spot, so it's going to take a lot to make you want to play them. Is that 35-point discount enough? I think it's worth trying. That sort of huge flying range, the way you can kind of protect yourself, land on some terrain, shoot down from the terrain, go somewhere else, land on terrain. It's definitely worth a try, although, I wouldn't bet the house on it anytime soon. They also have just a lot of leaders that went down in points, like all of these factions, leaders getting easier to kill but going down in points quite a bit. One that I'm kind of interested in is the Melusai Iron Scale, just because her sort of buddies, in terms of the other snake ladies that did kind of her role better, they both went up, and so that might be an interesting one to try, although, man, the Bloodrack Medusa ability is just so good that it might be worth just keeping that anyway. Overall, though, a lot of interest in Daughters of Khaine. There were way fewer nerfs than buffs. Now, the nerfs hit the one list that was really, really powerful out of dock. The buffs kind of hitting every single other thing. So I think it's going to be really interesting for those players to kind of try to figure out what's the play now and what's good now, because I think it's definitely going to be different. Fyreslayers. They have an ability a reaction called Gathered Heroes, where as soon as an enemy fighter finishes a move within 3 inches of them, they pick another friendly fighter within 3 inches of them. That fighter makes a bonus move, has to finish within 1. Now, we've seen this in various forms before. Obviously, the best version is the Gloomspite Gitz version, but this still, lets you use a Volkite to get a Doomseeker into combat. It does incentivize you to use range 1 heroes, right? Because, having to come in within 1, you may as well just get the most point-for-point damage that you can. You're not really trying to hold people off with your range 2 there. Fyreslayers do have some interesting range 2 heroes, but this reaction maybe kind of disincentivizes you a little bit. However, this is just a really solid reaction. It changes how the opponent has to play into you. You can kind of bait them. You don't want to get baited yourself, though, into doing it. Like, you could move a hero into fighting range, and then they just use their next activation to attack your hero, something like that. So, don't get too trigger happy with this, but it's definitely something you can do, and the Fyreslayers profile changes, which we'll see, definitely facilitate using this kind of attack very easily. But first, before I do that, I want to go into the abilities. Icon of Grimnir was nerfed. It has a 3-inch range now instead of a 6-inch range. It was already bad, so now you can just ignore it. Sling Shield Charge was buffed. Now it's exactly the same as normal charge damage ability. Before, it just didn't make any sense. Why would you even have it that way? So now it's in line with the rest of the game, so that's good. Volcano's Call was nerfed. It deals a little bit less damage now, but the Rune Master went down 50 points. So I would say that that's worth it. I would say that's more than worth it. The Rune Master is much more playable now with the weaker ability, so definitely a fine trade-off there. So let me go back to that reaction for a bit, or at least talking about the reaction, because of how it's going to affect your games, right? So for that reaction, you want these cheap fighters running all over the board so that your 3-inch bubble of being able to react is very wide, right? And then you're going to want all three, you're going to want the full complement of exciting heroes to use. You have that now. Volkite Berserkers went down to 65 points, and they went +1 strength, so they're just better all around. That's really exciting. You can bring in allies to have even more exciting fighters, because it just says friendly fighter. You can have even more exciting fighters to be kind of leaping into position with your Volkite Berserkers. Or you can just, go pure Fyreslayers, because some of the melee fighting heroes definitely went down in points. I'm looking at the Hearthguard Berserker Carls. I'm looking at the Rune Father, although I think that one might be 2-inch range, but it's still kind of interesting. And then, of course, the Rune Master, which went down 50 points and has that sort of damage ability there. Doom Seekers are kind of interesting. So I also wanted to talk about Duty Unto Death. Now that's the Hearthguard Berserker Carls. This is kind of a soft buff to that ability because you can just put more Hearthguard Berserkers into a list. Duty Unto Death, of course, being you get a Rampage for a triple if you've taken damage, a certain amount of, I think at least 5 damage already. Could be kind of difficult to sort of plan because, you know, if your opponent can just be bursting them down one by one, that's bad for you. But one thing that's nice here is if you've got, you know, say your leader's suite is 3 Hearthguard Berserker Carls, and then you've got a bunch of Volkite Berserkers, you could basically make it very difficult for your opponent to just burst down these Carls one by one, because your Volkite Berserkers are kind of blinking them straight into combat, sort of forcing the issue, forcing your opponent to end up fighting them with things that won't be able to kill them within the space of one round. And then that lets you kind of right into the next round just start rampaging right away, which, you know, can give you some really sweet options. So I think that there's a lot to play around with Fyreslayers. It's not necessarily going to be immediately obvious just looking at the stat cards, because with stat cards you're just looking at, you know, what was probably the worst faction in the game before, and now everything's just a little cheaper, so like what does that mean? But I think what it actually means for you is that all of your abilities are in a completely new context than they were before, because all of your fighters are so much cheaper, and you have this new reaction that can completely change sort of the geometry of the battlefield. So I think that that's a really exciting place for Fyreslayers to be into, and you know, I think if you like them, you're going to have a great time. Also, Auric Hearthguard, that was one of the fighters that I was most interested in before because of the ability to kind of hamstring your opponent. I'm sort of always very high on disruption abilities. Those had taken a really big nerf in the previous edition. They basically undid the nerf, giving them 20 points back, which they really needed. So yeah, just a lot to be happy about if you're a Fyreslayers fan. So now let's go into Idoneth Deepkin. These are the Sea Elves. I'm going to start with Fade from Memory. When an enemy fighter finishes a move action within 3 inches of them, if there's another friendly fighter visible to that enemy fighter and within range of at least one of that enemy fighter's melee weapons, for the rest of the battle round, that enemy fighter cannot target this fighter. So basically, it's kind of awkward, right? Because you are essentially taking a cheap fighter, because you really only use reactions on your cheap fighters, and you're just saying, don't attack me, you have to attack my buddy here. Normally, I would say that that's not necessarily what you want. However, things like treasure, hunter missions, you force your opponent to attack the eel, the Achillean king, the thing that they're not going to be able to get enough sort of traction on to put into danger anyway. And then that can essentially be a wasted attack for them. So for certain missions, I think that this can be really solid, but it's going to be hard to use effectively, because a lot of opponents are going to aggress onto you just playing around this. Essentially, all you'll do is maybe tax your opponent's movement a little bit. So against opponents whose warbands are already pretty solid in the treasure and hunter missions that this is going to be good in, this won't really affect them much. I think it'll be more just really solid against maybe some of the more slow-moving warbands that that would already struggle in those missions. For abilities, the only one is that Scryfish Shoal was nerfed. The EV is 4 damage now instead of 5. Not much of a difference really there. The Soul Scryer went up in points, and it got weaker with this ability getting worse. Nobody was taking it already, so I don't know why they just punished it so much. Maybe the idea here is that Scryfish Shoal was already just way too powerful, and that all of us were idiots for not taking the Soul Scryer. I don't know. I'm curious to see. I would love to speak with someone from GW about, you know, how their testing differed from community tournament experience, and whether, you know, they were finding lists, say, with these Soul Scryers that were just totally busted and required you to just nerf the Soul Scryer into the ground, like way more than anyone could have conceived of, if these were just like dominating what other people were considering tournament lists. So for their profiles, it's rough times if you're a Sea Elf player. Now, we'll start with the bright spot, right? Achelian Kings are still really solid. Now they have 2 attack profiles instead of just 1. They have the Spear and the Great Sword. Now, the Sword is a lot better for killing chaff. You get that extra attack. The Spear, I think, is better for dueling leaders and elites because essentially you have 1 less attack, but you have 1 more strength, so your DPA 5 is going to be better, your DPA 4 is going to be better. But then also you have that extra range so that you can pop down, you pop down without, outside of their attack range. You use your ability so that your, damage per attack, you're getting more out of that sort of strength 5 situation, and then you're not getting attacked back very efficiently. I think that that's really valuable, again, just for dueling elites already. I think whether or not this edition is a chaff edition or an elite edition is going to really affect which Achelian King you want to bring. However, no matter what, one of the Achelian Kings is going to be one of the best fighters in Order at doing one of those 2 jobs, right? The Sword Achelian King is one of the best fighters in Order at killing chaff. The Spear Achelian King is one of the best fighters in Order at dueling other elites. That part's really cool. Also, Ishlayan Eels, still solid. The Morsar Guard, they've kind of gone a little different now. I still don't like them as much, but -5 points is welcome there. The issue really is that all of their foot troops just took a huge beating. Namarti Reavers going up 15 points just feels completely unnecessary, especially when you look at Sentinels just being 1 inch slower, but 90 points already. If a Sentinel is 90 points, it's just tough. It's a tough look going up to 105 for Reavers. Namarti Thralls staying at 80 points, but just doing way less damage now. The whole point of them before was that they were glass cannons. Now they are both glass and not a cannon. You just can't take them. The foot heroes got a lot worse as well. They all went up points, other than the Tidecaster, which actually has kind of an interesting ability. So I would say the Tidecaster is a very interesting include if you're into Idoneth. But otherwise, there's really just not much to like here. So I would say at this point, until we see more, you have the sea monster lists. Those are still they're still playable. You can either go with 1 king, 2 princes, and a regular eel, or you can go with 2 kings and 2 eels. Either construction is totally valid. I would maybe consider going 1 sword king, 1 spear king, and 2 regular eels. But, lots to play around with in terms of what is the ideal sea monster list. However, beyond the sea monsters, I don't know that there's much you can really do with Idoneth Deepkin, which is a shame because before, I put them at the top of my casual tier list because they had such a small roster, and yet you had maybe 4 or 5 different, completely different but very good playstyles that you could use with Idoneth. Now that's just really not true, which is just a shame. So, too bad. Luckily, you can at least do something effective, right? I do think those sea monster lists are going to be solid. You're going to be able to sort of win games with them, although they are a skew list. Not every... Some victory conditions you're going to be wildly favored. Some you're just going to feel like you have no chance. Overall, it's going to work in that you'll have a very functional warband, but it's just tough to see kind of the breadth of Idoneth just really go down the tubes there. Let's just do a quick one on Khainite Shadowstalkers. Because the real question here is, how much does adding 1 move to an already really fast faction help them? Each additional 1 point of movement helps less the further away you get from move 3. There's also the fact that, the Shroud Queen is a little higher impact now, but you pay a lot for that impact. That can be a little tough. Overall, I think a lot of these are overall buffs, right? The issue is that because everything in the warband went up in points, list building is just going to be a lot more difficult now. Their reaction is the same as the Night Haunt one. It's the distance-gated teleport. If they move within 3, you can teleport so that you're the same distance from them that you were before. I think it's a good reaction. I'm a big fan of all the reactions that aren't just an upgraded counter. But, you know, like what I said with Night Haunt, it's going to take a long time, I think, for people to figure out exactly how good that is, how much, you know, we know sort of theoretically some of the things you can do with it. Like you can, if someone comes near you but there's a wall nearby, you can teleport to put the wall between you and them so now they can't attack you. Or if you're next to a wall and they go to the other side, you can teleport around the wall and now you're going to be in combat with them if that's what you want. You can be in a one-on-one situation, someone teleports or walks near a friendly fighter, you teleport into combat with them out of the combat you were in before. You can do that. You can really kind of mess with your opponent's positioning a lot of different ways this way. The question is, how much is that going to change just the sheer numbers game of damage and durability that Khainite Shadowstalkers with a really careful play could overcome before, but you know, the raw numbers sort of being shoved down your throat are a lot heavier now, and you cost a lot more points. Okay, so let's go into a faction finally that, you know, is a real winner, definitely a winner from this edition. I guess Fyreslayers were too, but Kharadron Overlords get a lot of pretty exciting stuff here. Now, the reaction is not the exciting thing. It's essentially just a ranged counter. Every once in a while, you'll be glad you have it. It only works if the attacker is within your range, of course, or within range of one of your weapons. But I think it's nice, increased flexibility. Again, I'm not that into the upgraded counters, but this, I think, fulfills a different role because the anti-ranged universal reaction is awful, barely even worth reading. So the fact that this replaces such a terrible ability is occasionally going to be interesting. As far as ability changes, Grapnel Launcher moved to a triple. That's a big downgrade compared to a double, but you have move 10. You didn't really need it already. I know some people used it, but in general, I just don't think it's nearly as much value add as a lot of other abilities would be. Aether Storm was nerfed slightly, but it's still solid. It hits on a 3 now, but instead of a 2. The KO profiles, there's a ton of changes. So the first is to look at what they did to the guns, because that's, you know, the majority of KO profiles, even though that's not kind of what there is to be played, but the majority of KO profiles kind of took some hits. Things like the Aether Cannons, which got weaker. Volley Guns, you know, took a huge beating, -3 attacks. They literally cut the effectiveness of a volley gun in half. But Fight for Profit combos are going to have even more insane potential here because a lot of the things that benefit from them went way down in points, and the leaders went down in points. So you can be fighting for profit and just have way more shooters, you know, nearby. Before, it was just really hard to get more than one big gun nearby your fight for profit sort of locus. Whereas now it's going to be really easy to get 2 sizable guns near your leader, so that you can, you know, get some really huge firepower out of Fight for Profit. So even though each individual gun I think is a little bit worse, list building is so much smoother now that I actually think those, if you want to do a Fight for Profit combo, it's going to take some real Johnnying around, some real kind of tinkering, but I think you're going to be able to figure out something that was at least just as strong as it was before. Melee balloons were just generally improved. The Engine Rigger with Aethermatic Saw went down 15 points and stayed the same. The Sky Warden with the Spear went down 15 points and stayed the same. I was already a really big fan of Mizzen Masters and Custodians. Now, they did get 6 wounds weaker, which is a lot of wounds. However, you know, they both went down 15 points, which makes them really flexible for list building. One went down 15, one went down 20 points. I think I'm more into the Custodian now, with them kind of both going down this way, but hey, I'd already built a Mizzen Master, so that's what I'm on now. I still think, though, that they're going to be really solid and really useful, and using the kind of basic versions of them is also going to be intriguing now in a way that it wasn't really before. So I think that's really exciting. KO in general, just getting up in your face, is a lot more of something that's going to happen. And a big part of that is because Arcanaut Company got massive buffs. The Spear, which was already one of the more damage efficient things you could do in the game, went down 5 points. The basic Arcanauts went down 15 points, which is incredible. 50 points is so cheap for 12 wounds and pistol shots. The pistols, each pistol isn't very exciting, but now that they only cost 50 points, yeah, it's only 8 range, but man, it's a little bit like Skinks were before. It's just a lot of shots. So Arcanaut Gunline is going to be a thing. You're probably not going to get big fight for profit combos on tons of Arcanauts, but who knows? Maybe it's worth trying. It's absolutely worth trying. So yeah, this is a pretty exciting faction in terms of what you got, right? They kind of pretended to throw a lot of nerfs your way. They nerfed a lot of the guns. They took down the wounds on a lot of the heroes. They did a lot to hurt you, but everything that was already pretty good before, right? You were already, considering playing Arcanauts. I think the balloons were already solid. I guess the volley guns were probably one of the best things before, and those got a lot worse. But for the most part, a lot of the stuff that was solid before got significantly better, and so this faction is just really strong now in a way that it wasn't before. The playstyle, though, is going to be pretty different with no volley guns. Let's talk about Lumineth Realmlords. They have an ability, Blinding Brilliance. When they're targeted, shooty style, but before the hit rolls get made. For every hit roll, you roll a dice for each crit, and on a 4-up, it's just a regular hit. The actual damage reduction here is probably going to be pretty low. It's maybe valuable for, when a true artillery piece is shooting at you, like one of those 4/8s, something like that. Then it's maybe valuable, but then only having a 50% chance to get rid of the damage, I wouldn't say that that's worth an action unless you're very confident that you're going to get killed from the blast, unless, a miracle happens. And even then, how often you're going to use it remains to be seen. We don't really know. A lot of shooters took pretty big nerfs, so how much shooting are we actually going to see is, I think, a real valid question. We did see a few ability changes. Sharp-Eyed Scryhawk is on a triple now. This is the one where you pick something and then everything gets +1 attack against it. I think this more accurately reflects its power. They also nerfed the High Sentinel. Maybe that double nerf wasn't necessary, but either way, it's still going to be playable now. It's still a pretty reasonably powerful ability. Emotional Transference was nerfed. This is really too bad. This was one of 1.0's coolest combos. Now, it was an ally-based combo. Essentially, you would bring in your Cenari Cathalar into, a Stormcast list, and then you could sort of blink the ability off of a Stormcast and get, huge damage because you could force them to attack it just by how fast they were and how many wounds they had, and you could just put it straight into their face. Unfortunately, it was nerfed twice, essentially. Well, it's only usable on friendly Lumineth Realmlords, which just takes out the huge potential you had with Stormcast. So that's just too bad to see. But I get that they had to do it if they're going to go to a kind of all allies list building regime. Shining Company was not buffed, but it was buffed by proxy. Essentially, all the things with warrior rune marks went down, which means this is way easier to trigger. So let's go into it, right? The main thing just being that Venari Wardens went down to 65 points. They're the ones that have Shining Company. So that's a huge buff for both the ability and, of course, for Wardens in general, right? They have 5 move and 3 range, so a lot of threat range coming up in a huge bubble onto you. So there's a lot of missions where there's a relevant piece in the center of the board, and then 2 deployment groups each 9 inches away. If you put Wardens up 3 3 inches forward, your opponent can't go they can't go near that center important point without all of your wardens being able to move once and attack them, which is extremely relevant because at 65 points, you're going to be poised to sometimes have activation advantage. You're going to be able to wait, force them to come in. One warden is not really the most scary damage dealer, but many wardens is actually pretty reasonable from a damage output perspective. So if someone's going to go on to an objective and then get hit by, 3 different wardens, that actually becomes something to worry about if you're gonna, roll a few crits and all of a sudden they're in a lot of trouble. So big glow up for them. I think Stone Guards are kind of interesting now with these points decreases. It became a lot easier to pump their movement. I think this 85 point range of having some pretty lethal sort of attack profiles is going to be interesting. I think it's worth tinkering around with, although I do think that there's a little bit more power in a lot of Wardens than there is in a bunch of Stone Guard. But maybe there's a balance there to strike. I think that there's a lot to look at in terms of the sort of general wizard buff, but it's tough to say really. The Cathalar, for example, going down 20 points, but then that ability getting nerfed in such a big way. The Caligrave has kind of an odd ability to use. So there's definitely, like every faction with a bunch of wizards in it, it's definitely worth testing these wizards, but I'm a little bit more skeptical of these than I am about some of the other ones. Unfortunately, the Blade Lords, they got that extra inch of reach, but man, they really paid for it on their points. 15 points is a lot to give up there. So I don't know. I would hesitate to sort of build a bunch of Blade Lords as the backbone of your warband, especially when you can already kind of get this sort of movement and reach and damage efficiency kind of all together in one package with the Wardens. I would probably lean Wardens as kind of doing the Blade Lord job better than Blade Lords do it. All right, it's dinosaur time. Their reaction is called Starborn. After their targeted melee style, before the hit rolls are made, count up to 2 critical hits as regular hits instead. It's just wild to me that you can have ones that sort of you try on a 4-up to see if you manage to do this, and then this one just gets your first 2 crits, bam. In general, I'm not a fan of the damage reduction reactions because to me, they're mostly just useful when you are desperate to go from probably going to die to an attack to hopefully surviving it. But this is the best one of them and probably the most consistent of them. So whether or not this is good enough to redeem the category, I guess the one that pre-heals you 3 is probably better than this one. But this one's still solid, maybe good enough to redeem the category, maybe not. It's definitely one that you will use sometimes. So unlike some of the reactions that are, in a pretty rough spot, this one is certainly something that you're going to use, even if it's not one of the more powerful ones in the game. The only ability change I spotted was, or at least the relevant one, is that Lords of Space and Time was nerfed. It's a lot less flexible now. It says Seraphon only. You must be wholly within the dice value. It's still good, right? But it's just your hopes of teleporting Stormcast leaders around are kind of dead. Now, if you look at the profile changes, there are actually some pretty reasonable foot-slogging Saurus leaders to mess around with. So even though it's definitely a nerf to Lords of Space and Time, there's still stuff you can do here, right? The Saurus Old Blood, significantly more powerful now and cheaper. The Saurus Sunblood, I think, is really interesting. All of these foot-slogging Saurus leaders improving helps the Slann because, the Slann went up 15 points, but the total cost of going Slann plus 2 of these new and improved Saurus leaders, that whole price went down, and the Saurus leaders are more effective than they were before. So I think that that's kind of an exciting thing. I don't know if that's the most competitive way to build Seraphon or just a competitive list at all, but it's quite the combo, and it's something that I've seen. So, for example, with Kagra's Ravagers, using those similar teleport combos. They can be pretty effective in the right situation. The issue is kind of finding the right shell to put them in. Now, where that comes in is kind of tough here, right? Because Skinks were pretty broadly nerfed. Saurus were buffed in a really big way, but they have a totally different role now because to match their buff, they also took points increases. Whether or not Saurus kind of work as a backbone troop to your warband, I think is going to really require testing. They're just in a completely different role than they were before. The other thing that's interesting to think about with Seraphon is that the dinosaur flyers, now speed generally took a big nerf kind of throughout the game, but the dinosaur flyers, their nerf just wasn't nearly as hard as a lot of the other ones in the game. So I think that it might be worth taking one. They went, a lot of them went down in points. Ripperdactyls stayed the same and went down 15 points. I think, it might be worth taking one of those. So there's a lot to think about. It's not going to be as easy to just like spam Skinks and then kind of face roll your opponent off the board. That used to be kind of the plan for Seraphon. And then even sort of after the Tome of Champions changed, you still had these Salamander combos that were pretty insane. Salamanders are still a pretty reasonable sort of artillery platform. The issue is that sort of boosting them with Skink Handlers I think is a little tougher now, since Skink Handlers cost 70 points. That whole kind of combo costing you 205 points is a little bit less attractive to me, but still doable. I think Salamanders at least benefit from the fact that so many other fighters that do the same thing that a Salamander does were nerfed in a really big way. So there's this weird way in which comparatively they actually didn't make out that badly. Overall, Seraphon, a lot to think about. A lot's going to change with their lists. Old Seraphon lists just don't exist anymore. But I do think that there's definitely stuff to play around with casually. Now, whether that kind of makes it into the competitive scene is going to be interesting. I really don't know what to tell you, whether it will or won't. Sylvaneth. Their reaction is Vengeful Spites. After their targeted melee style, before the hits, for each hit roll that hits, allocate 1 damage to the attacking fighter. For each crit, allocate 2. So this is like counter, but it peaks when they do really well. It is at its worst when they do poorly. I think that just makes it much better than counter, even though the EV is about the same. I would say happy to use this a lot of the time, but I'm not going to use it in any situation where I wouldn't have used counter anyway. So as a value add, it's pretty poor, but it's fine. Sylvaneth abilities, we had some changes. The first is that Draw from the Spirit Song was buffed. It now heals the full dice value. On rate, as far as how much damage can you get out of a double, this is starting to add up. This is equivalent to some of the best doubles in the game in terms of just how much damage they change to. Now, whether that makes it worth it, right? Because heals are a lot less flexible. If something gets killed before it can do the heal, it doesn't do it. If you are wishing you could pre-heal because you're already at full health but you're about to go into a tough fight, you can't do it. So heals are pretty inflexible. So I think it has to be better on rate than the corresponding damage abilities to be just as good as them. So this is starting to add up, but I don't know if it really gets there. It is at least enough that you'll use it occasionally, whereas before you wouldn't. Trample Underfoot was completely deleted. This is a mild nerf to Kurnoth Hunters. It makes it a lot harder for them to finish off a fighter that's just on 1 or 2 wounds, which is just a tough look in general for such a sort of big, beefy fighter. There's a new quad, Thrumming with Life. It's terrible. Don't read it. Zephyr Spite's Tail Pinchers. This is the less interesting ability from the Arch Revenants. It became more reliable. So if you were considering, and this is just, it's a piece for finishing off enemy fighters who are low, consider saving your Onslaughts on Arch Revenants because, something that Onslaught might have killed but might not have. Now you can maybe wait and try to use the Tail Pincers, and then hopefully get value elsewhere. I realize this is one of the new archers, not an arch revenant. It's a little confusing here because they have the same kind of body structure. But yeah, it's an interesting little buff here, but not gonna like completely change how Sylvaneth plays. What will change how they play though is the all of the changes to their profile. So first, Sylvaneth obviously missed the loss of Underworlds the most out of any faction. Underworlds gave them like a completely different paradigm for all their chaff, gave them, some of the best chaff in the entire game, just because all of their chaff models had like real utility to them and real kind of texture to them, which let you kind of really sort of change up what you were doing in any given game. They don't have that now, which is kind of too bad. What they do have is Spite Revenants still have that net ability. Tree Revenants still have a teleport, although you pay a lot more for it than you did before. However, they're also a lot less fragile, which is kind of nice. Kurnoth Hunters got a pretty big buff to the rank and file. Now, the leaders did get nerfed. They went up in points for the most part, although the one with the bow, I believe, no, the one with the sword, sorry, went down to 215. So, the Kurnoth Hunters, the +1 strength is interesting. You see it kind of peppered throughout the game a little bit, and I wonder if it's made to deal with all the buffs they gave to Stormcast. I think you're going to see a lot of Stormcast because, one, you did before in casual tournaments because people just own Stormcast. So if they're like, I want to try out this new game, they're going to use whatever models they've got, and Stormcast are really easy to build a warband with if you just have some random ones lying around. So I do wonder if these strength buffs are kind of with that in mind. Now, they've also just got these new fighters. They have really weird stats. The Gossamed Archers only deal 2 attacks. Unless you're throwing around 2 like strength 6 attacks, and I know they're going to connect, man, I'm just usually not interested in rolling so few dice. But the thing is, I don't think you should ever really underestimate cheap flyers. The Revenant Seeker comes in at 165 points for 20 flying wounds at 10-inch range. That's a pretty good amount of kind of flying durability. I think it's probable that you can find some real uses for that. It's also worth talking about, before I kind of go into more detail with Sylvaneth, the Arch Revenant's 15-point hike is really interesting because that used to be an absolutely must-take model. The question here is, whether the buff to Kurnoths and the nerf to the Arch Revenant makes you want to kind of rework your list to kind of be more Kurnoth focused, or if, hey, flying dragons are important, always keep them. Whether that just kind of keeps hold and you just want to stick with your Arch Revenant. A lot to kind of test out there. So, like I said before, the Kurnoths got buffed, and this is one of the warbands I actually play quite a bit. So I wanted to kind of take a look to see, how does the buff fit in context. So a Kurnoth Greatsword costs 170 points. So I wanted to kind of balance it against a Liberator with Grandblade. 160 points, fills a very similar role. Also move 4, range 1, a pretty pure combat model. If they're not using abilities, the Kurnoth is toughness 4, it has 28 wounds, it has a DPA 5 of 6, so that's DPA 5 is just what it would be dealing per attack against the Liberator, which has toughness 5. The Liberator's got toughness 5 with 20 wounds instead of 28, but the DPA 4 is 7.33. So a Kurnoth is going to kill a Liberator in 3 1/3 activations. The Liberator is going to kill the Kurnoth in 3.83 activations. So with no abilities, it's going to feel like your Kurnoth Hunters are kind of gaining ground against the Liberator. There's so much randomness within a dice roll that anything can happen in one game, but just on average, like if you've got 3 or 4 of these fights happening across the board, your Kurnoths are going to come ahead much more often than they come out behind. The issue is what happens when you bring in abilities, right? Because what's more often going to happen than having 3 or 4 of these fights around the board is you're going to have two of these fights around the board, or one or two, right? Because you don't put that many Kurnoths in a list. You don't put that many Stormcast in a list. Well, a Kurnoth has access to Spirit Song, so they can heal, let's say 5 each round. I know it could be like 4, 5, or 6, really, but let's say on average you're going to be healing 5 each round. So on an abstract, because one round is 2 activations, let's say it's minus 2.5 DPA towards your opponent. Now that's even pretty generous because, like I was saying before, there's a lot of situations where you can't actually use your heal. You can't kind of preload your heal before you go into combat. You can't say if you went second that round but you get killed, you can't use your heal, you know it. So there's a lot of kind of inflexibility with heals. But let's just give it the benefit of the doubt and say it's removing 2.5 DPA from the opponent. Well, the problem here is a Liberator goes to 11.67 DPA 4 when it's got Laylo the Tyrant active. That is absurd in terms of how quickly that kills a Kurnoth Hunter. So even with Spirit Song happening, the Liberator kills the Kurnoth in 3.05 activations, which is, you know, the Kurnoth killing the Liberator in 3 1/3 is unchanged, right? Because one is defense for the Kurnoth, the other is offense for the Liberator. That's the only relationship that's changed here. The reason why, you know, one, you're paying less points for the Liberator with Grandblade. You're paying the same amount of resources and dice. The Liberator is going towards killing the Kurnoth significantly faster, you know, given those handicaps. And then also there's the fact that you have to really consider the fact that the Liberator might just kill the Kurnoth in one round of combat before the Kurnoth can even use Spirit Song. Because, you know, 11.67 DPA 4, that's, you know, 23 or in the average round of combat. It's not that crazy it's not that crazy of a sort of difference from the mean to actually just swing out that whole 28 damage using Laylo the Tyrant. So, man, I think the Kurnoth Hunter just loses both point for point and just sometimes, even just sometimes in general. Sometimes it just loses badly. So, you know, is that kind of showdown close enough that you can fool yourself into saying you can win elsewhere? Well, okay, Sylvaneth has a lot of flying utility. Sylvaneth has access to a lot of chaff. Sylvaneth has access to nets. Sylvaneth has a lot of tools at its disposal. But you just have to think about how Kurnoths, yes, they're getting this buff, but the best move for just beat sticks in the game got much bigger buffs than the Kurnoth Hunters did. So you're really going to, I think you're going to want to include Kurnoths in your list, but you aren't going to get away with leaning entirely on Kurnoth Hunters, because the other factions that have gotten buffs to their move 4 beat sticks, they're just getting buffed more, and they're just going to do more to you, and you're just not going to get away with just completely leaning on the nice buffs that your Kurnoths got. So you're going to want to probably include maybe 3 Kurnoths in your list, maybe 1 Huntmaster, 2 regular Kurnoths in your list, something like that. But you're probably going to want to fill the rest of your lists out with utility pieces, and your Kurnoths are just going to hold the ground long enough for your utility pieces to kind of win the game. You're not going to win just spamming Kurnoths. So that's my little kind of brewing hint here as far as what I've seen so far from Sylvaneth, from what the math looks like. I'm excited to get into more brewing. I will get into a lot more kind of specific stuff in my last video before Nova. I have a lot of painting to do before that tournament, so I will be doing one last kind of what does brewing look like for the new edition. What are kind of some lists that are coming across my spreadsheets, you know, that I've been writing down in my notebooks, things like that. I will have, one last video for that, and then it's, you know, locking in on the painting, getting that done before the tournament, and then, of course, when Nova Open happens, and it's the first event with all of the, you know, stuff from the new edition, I'm going to be so excited. I'm going to cover all of it with every angle. So until then, may all your rolls be crits.